The chamber of the Grand Federation's council shimmered with holographic light, a kaleidoscope of alien visages forming a council of worlds. They represented the collective wisdom of 1,000 species, the apex of galactic civilization, or so they thought. Their deliberations were interrupted by the arrival of an urgent communique, marked with the highest security clearance. The sender was Commander Zoltran of the Ecliptica. His image flickered to life, his reptilian features tense and eyes blazing with an emotion rarely seen in his kind. Fear. "This is not a greeting," he began, his voice gravelly but steady. "It is a warning, a dire one." The counselors exchanged wary glances. Warnings were not uncommon, but something in Zoltran's tone commanded attention. "I speak of the humans," Zoltran continued. "You know them as average, unremarkable. A species neither blessed with superior intelligence, nor cursed with debilitating stupidity. Their technology is primitive compared to ours. Their strength, middling. Their lifespan, fleeting. Yet, I tell you now, there is one thing they excel at, one trait that makes them more dangerous than any species in this galaxy." Zoltran leaned closer, his scaled face filling the chamber. "They adapt. The human element." Zoltran's story began as a mere anecdote, a curiosity to be filed away. He had hired a human janitor named Kara, a recommendation from a harbor master who vouched for her work ethic. On paper, she was utterly unremarkable. Average intelligence, no exceptional skills, no noteworthy accolades. She was hired to clean floors and restock vending machines, and that was exactly what she did. Quietly, efficiently, invisibly, until the children came aboard. The Ecliptica was a cargo vessel, but it often transported families across the stars. This time, it carried a group of younglings from 3 different species: the fur-covered Exani, the crystalline Neuraline, and the sharp-clawed Rexus. Despite their differences, they were typical juveniles, curious, noisy, and often underfoot. Kara, to the crew's surprise, gravitated toward them. In her downtime, she played their games, learned their songs, and even devised new activities that blended their disparate cultures. What began as a way to keep the children occupied quickly became something more. The younglings adored her, and even the most skeptical adults found themselves charmed by her patience and creativity. "She made them laugh," Zoltran recounted to the council. "Do you know how rare that is? To bridge the cultural gaps of 3 entirely different species. She did it as if it were nothing. At first, I dismissed it as a harmless quirk. I was wrong. The crisis. It started with a malfunction. The Ecliptica's navigation systems began to fail, and soon the ship was adrift near a volatile nebula. The crew scrambled to diagnose the issue, but the situation worsened when the reactor began to overheat. Panic spread through the ship like wildfire. Kara, the janitor, was not in the control room. She was in the lower decks with the children, keeping them calm, or so everyone assumed. When Zoltran received a report that Kara had entered the engineering bay, a restricted area, he was furious. What business did a janitor have meddling with the ship's systems? He stormed down to confront her, expecting incompetence or, worse, sabotage. What he found was something entirely different. Kara was surrounded by a mess of wires, tools, and half-disassembled panels. Her hands moved with a precision that belied her lack of formal training. She was patching a bypass circuit, a solution the engineering team had yet to consider. Zoltran's fury turned to astonishment as the reactor's alarms silenced and the ship's systems began to stabilize. "How?" he demanded. She looked up, her face smeared with grease. "I just figured it out." The warning. Zoltran's holographic image leaned back, his gaze sweeping the council chamber. "Figured it out," he repeated, his voice heavy with meaning. "That is the essence of humanity. They figure things out. They adapt, improvise, and overcome. And they do it with an ease that defies logic." The council murmured among themselves, but Zoltran raised a clawed hand to silence them. "You think this is a tale of one extraordinary individual," he said. "It is not. Kara is not unique among humans. She is a product of their nature, a species that thrives on chaos, that bends it to their will. They see problems not as barriers, but as challenges. And challenges, counselors, are what they live for." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This is why I warn you. Humans are neither allies to take lightly nor enemies to provoke. They are the fulcrum upon which the fate of this galaxy may one day turn. Underestimate them, and you may not live to regret it." The hologram flickered, then vanished. The council chamber fell silent, and somewhere in the vast expanse of the galaxy, a human janitor named Kara returned to her duties, blissfully unaware of the storm her actions had unleashed among the stars. The crisis unfolds. The ecliptica drifted in the eerie glow of the nebula, its silver hull reflecting the violent swirls of gas and plasma. Inside, the ship was chaos incarnate. Alarm klaxons blared, casting the corridors in pulsing red light. Crew members shouted orders, their voices rising in panic as systems continued to fail. The comforting hum of the engines had been replaced by an unsettling silence, broken only by the hiss of malfunctioning vents and the occasional crackle of overloaded circuits. Kara stood in the corner of the cargo bay, her hand resting lightly on a steel support beam as she watched the younglings huddle together. Their fur, scales, and crystalline forms quivered with fear. She could feel the tension in the air, a palpable weight pressing on her chest. No one had come to check on the children, and she understood why. The crew was too preoccupied with the failing ship to spare a thought for the smallest and most vulnerable among them. Her mind raced. She didn't know the intricacies of starship mechanics, but she knew enough to recognize that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't just a glitch or a minor failure. This was a death spiral. She glanced at the children, their wide, alien eyes looking to her for reassurance. She knelt, her voice calm but firm. "Stay here. I'll be back." The words were simple, but the determination behind them was ironclad. She strode out of the cargo bay, her boots echoing against the metal floor. She had no plan, no training, and no authority. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that the children were counting on her, and she refused to let them down. The corridors were a maze of chaos. Crew members ran past her, some carrying tools, others shouting updates. She heard snippets of conversation, something about the main reactor, the AI, and an impending explosion. She followed the noise, her instincts guiding her to the heart of the crisis. When she arrived at the engineering bay, she was met with a sight that made her stomach drop. The reactor core was exposed, its containment field flickering like a dying flame. Engineers worked frantically, their faces etched with desperation. Sparks flew as someone attempted to patch a conduit, only for the connection to fail. A thick, acrid smoke hung in the air, stinging her eyes and throat. She hesitated for a moment, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the problem. Then she spotted it. A schematic displayed on a nearby console, its glowing lines and symbols incomprehensible to most but strangely intuitive to her. She didn't understand the technical jargon, but she could see the flow of energy, the bottlenecks, and the redundancies. It was like a puzzle, and puzzles were something she understood. Without thinking, she stepped forward. A reptilian engineer, his scales glinting in the dim light, barked at her to leave. She ignored him, her eyes locked on the schematic. Her hands moved almost of their own accord, grabbing tools and wires. She heard protests and shouts, but they faded into the background as she focused. Piece by piece, she began to rebuild the broken system, her mind working faster than she thought possible. At first, the engineers tried to stop her, but then something changed. One by one, they fell silent, their eyes widening as they watched her work. She wasn't just repairing the system, she was improving it, finding shortcuts and efficiencies that had eluded even the most experienced among them. Time seemed to stretch and contract as she worked, her movements a blur of precision and purpose. Finally, she stepped back, her hands trembling. The reactor core stabilized, its containment field glowing steadily. The alarms ceased, leaving behind a heavy silence. The engineers stared at her, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. "How did you?" one of them began, but he trailed off, unable to find the words. Kara shrugged, her face flushed with exertion. It just made sense. The moment was short-lived. A voice crackled over the intercom, sharp and urgent. "Bridge to engineering. We've detected an external threat. Multiple unidentified ships approaching fast." The engineers exchanged grim looks. Kara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The reactor was stable, but the Ecliptica was far from safe. She turned to the reptilian engineer who had initially shouted at her. "What's the plan?" she asked. He blinked, caught off guard by her directness. We hold them off as best we can." Kara nodded, her mind already racing. She wasn't a fighter, but she knew how to think under pressure. She had seen enough desperate situations in her life to know that survival often depended on quick thinking and bold action. She wasn't about to let the crew, or the children, down now. As the crew prepared for the impending battle, Kara found herself in an unfamiliar role. People were looking to her for guidance, their trust in her abilities unspoken but undeniable. She didn't have all the answers, but she had one thing no one else on the ship seemed to possess: an unshakable determination to adapt and overcome, no matter the odds. The first warning shots rocked the ship, sending a shudder through its hull. Kara gripped a nearby console, her jaw set in defiance. The fight for survival had begun, and she was ready to face it head-on. The Unity experiment. The Ecliptica shuddered again as another volley of plasma fire struck its shields. Lights flickered throughout the ship, casting the already chaotic corridors in eerie flashes of light and shadow. The bridge was a cacophony of shouted orders and alarms. Every station was manned, every crew member struggling to maintain control in the face of the relentless assault. Kara found herself standing near the edge of the bridge, out of the way but not unnoticed. Her presence was no longer a curiosity. It was a question mark hanging over the entire crew. She wasn't supposed to be here, not in the heart of the ship's command, and yet no one dared ask her to leave. Not after what she had done in engineering. Not after she had stabilized the reactor when everyone else had been on the verge of giving up. The captain, a towering Exani with fur that bristled like static charged wires, glanced at her. His voice was deep and commanding, but there was an edge of uncertainty when he addressed her. "We need options. Now." Kara blinked, momentarily taken aback. She wasn't used to being asked for her opinion, especially not in situations like this. Her mind raced, processing the chaos around her. The enemy ships were faster, better armed, and more numerous. The Ecliptica had the advantage of size and cargo, but those weren't weapons. Or were they? Her eyes darted to the holographic display showing the ship's layout and cargo manifest. The cargo bays were packed with industrial equipment, tools, materials, and spare parts meant for a distant mining colony. None of it was designed for combat, but that didn't mean it couldn't be used. "What about the cargo?" she asked, her voice cutting through the din. The captain turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "What about it?" "We've got enough materials down there to build something. Drones, decoys, maybe even weapons. We just need to think outside the box." There was a beat of silence, the kind that stretched just long enough to make her doubt herself. Then, to her surprise, the captain nodded. "Make it happen." The order sent ripples through the bridge. Kara didn't wait for permission or guidance. She bolted from the room, her heart pounding. She wasn't an engineer, but she had learned enough during her short time on the ship to know who could help. She made her way to the lower decks, where the engineering team was regrouping after the reactor incident. When she arrived, the crew looked up, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and curiosity. Kara didn't give them a chance to question her. She launched into her plan, explaining how the cargo could be repurposed into makeshift defenses. At first, there was hesitation. She was, after all, still the janitor in their eyes. But as she spoke, her passion and conviction began to cut through their doubts. One by one, They started to nod. Tools were gathered, schematics hastily drawn. The engineering bay became a flurry of activity. Kara worked alongside them, her hands dirty and her mind sharp. She didn't have the technical expertise of the others, but her ideas sparked solutions they hadn't considered. It was as if her lack of formal training allowed her to see possibilities they were too constrained to imagine. As the first prototypes took shape, word spread through the ship. Crew members from other departments began to trickle in, offering their help. The Axani, with their keen senses and nimble hands, worked on assembling delicate components. The Rexus, with their brute strength, handled the heavier tasks. Even the crystalline Nyraline, who rarely interacted with other species, contributed by using their unique ability to refract light into focused energy beams. It wasn't just a technical effort, it was a cultural one. The ship's diverse crew, who had always worked in parallel but rarely together, began to forge a unity they hadn't known was possible. And at the center of it all was Kara, the human who had somehow turned chaos into collaboration. By the time the enemy ships breached the outer defenses, the Ecliptica was ready. The makeshift drones buzzed through the corridors, carrying explosives to key points. Decoy systems lured the attackers into traps. The crew worked together with an efficiency born not of training, but of necessity and trust. Every species brought something unique to the fight, and every contribution was crucial. Kara found herself in the thick of it, directing operations from the engineering bay. Her voice, calm and steady, carried over the comms as she coordinated efforts. She wasn't just a janitor anymore. She wasn't even just a human. She was part of something bigger, something that had never existed before. A crew united not by duty, but by survival. The battle raged for hours, the Ecliptica holding its own against impossible odds. The enemy's superior firepower was matched by the crew's ingenuity and determination. For every advantage the attackers brought, the crew found a way to counter it. And at the heart of every decision, every daring maneuver, was Kara. When the last enemy ship finally retreated, the crew erupted into cheers. The damage to the Ecliptica was extensive, but they had survived. More than that, they had proven something to themselves, to each other, and perhaps to the galaxy. As the adrenaline faded and the crew began to take stock of their situation, Kara found herself standing in the center of the engineering bay, surrounded by faces that now looked at her with a mixture of respect and gratitude. She felt a wave of exhaustion crash over her, but it was accompanied by something else, a quiet sense of pride. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Kara, report to the bridge." She sighed, wiping her hands on her jumpsuit. The work wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt ready for whatever came next. As she made her way back to the bridge, she couldn't help but smile. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. Humans weren't meant to stand alone. They thrived when they stood together, even with those who were nothing like them. And in that unity, they were unstoppable. The Battle of the Nebula. The vast expanse of the nebula loomed outside the Ecliptica's fractured viewport, a swirling ocean of colors that seemed both mesmerizing and foreboding. The ship drifted in the void, its engines barely holding steady after the battle's toll. The crew worked feverishly to repair the damage, their newfound unity binding them together despite the lingering tension in the air. They knew the reprieve was temporary. The enemy wasn't gone, only regrouping. Kara stood in the center of the bridge, her presence now an unspoken constant. The captain paced nearby, his fur bristling as his sharp eyes scanned the tactical display. Red markers representing the enemy ships blinked ominously, circling like predators around wounded prey. The crew's faces were pale with exhaustion, but no one spoke of surrender. It wasn't an option. The enemy was relentless, their strategy precise and unyielding. They were herding the Ecliptica deeper into the nebula, where volatile pockets of gas and gravitational anomalies would make escape impossible. The captain growled under his breath, his claws flexing against the console. He turned to Kara, his voice tight with restrained frustration. "Suggestions. It still surprised her, the weight of his trust. She had gone from invisible to indispensable in a matter of hours. She leaned over the console, her eyes tracing the patterns on the map. The nebula's chaos wasn't just a trap, it was an opportunity. The swirling gases, the unstable gravity wells, these weren't obstacles. They were tools waiting to be used. They're pushing us into the nebula because they think we can't survive in there, she said, her voice steady despite the tension. But if we turn the nebula against them, it could be our advantage. The crew exchanged uncertain glances, their skepticism palpable. The captain tilted his head, his gaze fixed on her. Explain. Kara's mind raced. The nebula was a volatile mix of elements, each one a potential trigger for disaster or salvation. If they could lure the enemy ships into the densest regions and destabilize the pockets of gas, they could create a chain reaction. The nebula itself would do the work, turning the enemy's precision against them. We'll use drones, she continued, her thoughts forming into a plan as she spoke. Rig them with small charges, just enough to ignite the pockets of gas. The explosions will force them into tighter formations, and then, she gestured at the tactical map, drawing a line through the densest region. We lead them into the heart of the nebula. One big charge, and the whole thing goes up. The silence that followed was heavy. The plan was audacious, reckless even, but it was also their best shot. The captain's fur rippled as he weighed the risks, his sharp features unreadable. Finally, he nodded. Do it. The order set the crew into motion. Engineers scrambled to modify the drones, fitting them with makeshift charges and programming them for precision maneuvers. Pilots prepared to guide the ship through the most dangerous regions of the nebula, their hands steady despite the sweat on their brows. Kara worked alongside them, her presence a steadying force even as the countdown to chaos began. When the first wave of drones launched, the tension on the bridge was suffocating. The red markers on the tactical display closed in, the enemy ships tightening their formation as they pursued the ecliptica. The drones darted into the nebula's depths, their signals blinking out one by one as they completed their tasks. Moments later, the first explosion lit up the display. A chain reaction spread through the gas pockets, sending shockwaves rippling through the nebula. The enemy ships faltered, their precise formation thrown into disarray. The crew cheered, a brief moment of triumph cutting through the fear. But Kara knew the battle was far from over. Hold course, she said, her voice cutting through the noise. We're not done yet. The ecliptica plunged deeper into the nebula, the turbulence shaking the ship to its core. The enemy regrouped, their ships weaving through the chaos with unnerving determination. Kara's eyes remained fixed on the display, her mind calculating and recalculating the timing of the final charge. It had to be perfect. One mistake, and the entire crew would be lost. The tension reached its peak as the ship approached the heart of the nebula. The crew's voices blended into a single urgent hum, each member focused on their task. Kara's hand hovered over the control panel, her breath shallow as she waited for the right moment. Now, she whispered. The final charge detonated, a blinding flash that consumed the tactical display. The shockwave tore through the nebula, engulfing the enemy ships in a storm of fire and debris. The ecliptica lurched violently, its shield straining against the force. Alarms blared, but the ship held together, battered but intact. When the light faded, the display showed only one marker remaining. The ecliptica. The bridge erupted in cheers, the sound a mix of relief and exhilaration. Kara slumped against the console, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had never felt so drained or so alive. The captain approached her, his imposing figure casting a shadow over her. For a moment, he said nothing, his sharp eyes studying her. Then he extended a clawed hand, his expression softening into something that might have been gratitude. Well done, he said. Kara took his hand, her grip firm despite her fatigue. We did it together. As the crew began the long process of assessing the damage and plotting their next course, Kara allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. They had survived the impossible, not through strength or technology, but through ingenuity and unity. The nebula had been their crucible, and they had emerged stronger for it. But as she looked out at the swirling void, she knew their journey was far from over. The galaxy was vast and unpredictable, and the challenges ahead would be just as formidable. Still, for the first time, she felt ready to face them. Together, they could take on anything. The betrayal within. The Ecliptica was quieter now, its corridors dimly lit as the crew worked tirelessly to patch the scars left by the nebula battle. The air carried the sharp tang of burnt circuits and ozone, a constant reminder of how close they had come to destruction. Despite the calm, there was an undercurrent of unease rippling through the ship. The enemy had been defeated, but Kara could sense the weight of something unresolved, something unspoken. The bridge had become a gathering place, the crew assembling to plan their next move. Kara stood near the tactical display, its flickering light casting long shadows across the room. The captain addressed the crew, his voice steady but lacking its usual conviction. "We've survived the worst," he began, his fur still bristled from the tension. "But this isn't over. The enemy knew exactly where to find us, and that wasn't luck." The words hung heavy in the air, their implication cutting deeper than any weapon. The crew exchanged wary glances, their unease morphing into suspicion. Kara felt her stomach tighten. Betrayal was a wound that could tear apart even the strongest bonds, and the Ecliptica's fragile unity was still new, still vulnerable. The captain's gaze swept the room, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of guilt. "Someone on this ship is working against us." The accusation was a blade, slicing through the air. Murmurs broke out, growing louder with each passing second. The crew's once united front began to fracture, the cracks spreading like spiderwebs. Kara watched as trust dissolved before her eyes, replaced by fear and anger. A Rex's crew member, his claws tapping against the console, growled low in his throat. It could be anyone, even her. His gaze landed on Kara, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Kara felt the weight of the accusation but didn't flinch. She had expected this. Humans were the outsiders here, the wild cards in a galaxy that valued predictability. She met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. "If I wanted to sabotage this ship, I wouldn't have risked my life saving it." The room fell silent. The logic was irrefutable, but the tension remained. Kara stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Pointing fingers won't get us anywhere. If there's a traitor among us, we need to find them before they do more damage. But we do it together, not by tearing each other apart." Her words carried weight, not just because of what she had done for the ship, but because of how she said them, with conviction, with clarity. The captain nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before addressing the crew. "Kara is right. We'll find the truth, but we'll do it methodically. Every system will be checked, every comm log reviewed. No one is above suspicion, including me." The crew dispersed, each member assigned a task. Kara stayed behind, her mind racing. Trust was fragile, and the traitor, whoever they were, had already exploited that. She couldn't let them succeed in breaking the crew apart. Hours turned into days as the investigation unfolded. The crew worked in shifts, combing through logs and monitoring systems. The atmosphere aboard the Ecliptica grew heavier with each passing moment, the weight of suspicion pressing down on everyone. Kara kept herself busy, assisting where she could and offering quiet words of encouragement to those who needed it. Then, a breakthrough. The engineering team discovered a hidden signal embedded in the ship's communications array, a subtle but unmistakable trail leading back to one of their own. The signal had been masked, its origin buried under layers of encryption, but the engineers managed to trace it to a single source, a Nyraline navigator named Thren. The revelation sent shockwaves through the crew. Thren was quiet, reserved, the kind of individual who blended into the background. No one had suspected him, and that made the betrayal cut even deeper. The captain called an emergency meeting, the entire crew assembling in the main hold. Thren stood at the center, his crystalline form reflecting the harsh light. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by something darker, defiance. The captain's voice was low, dangerous. Why? Thren tilted his head, the faint hum of his crystalline body filling the silence. Because this ship was never meant to survive. You're pawns in a game far larger than you can imagine. I was simply ensuring the inevitable. The words sent a chill through the room. Kara stepped forward, her heart pounding. Who sent you? Thren's gaze shifted to her, his expression unreadable. You think this is about me? You're as much a part of this as anyone. The enemy knows about you, human. They know what your kind is capable of. That's why they'll stop at nothing to eliminate you. Kara's breath caught in her throat. The weight of his words settled on her like a physical force. Humanity wasn't just an anomaly in the galaxy. They were a threat. And now she understood why the enemy had been so relentless. Before the crew could react, Thren moved. His crystalline body refracted the light into a blinding flash, disorienting everyone. When the light faded, he was gone, his escape route carefully planned. The crew scrambled to seal the ship, but it was too late. Thren had vanished, leaving behind only questions and a crew on the brink of collapse. Kara stood in the aftermath, her mind racing. The betrayal had shaken them all, but it had also revealed something far more dangerous. Humanity's place in the galaxy was more precarious than she had ever imagined. And now, the enemy knew exactly who they were dealing with. The final stand. The Ecliptica limped through the void, its hull scorched and its systems barely holding together. The betrayal had fractured the crew's fragile unity, leaving tension simmering beneath the surface. Despite their efforts to seal the ship, Thren's escape had left a breach, a vulnerability the enemy would undoubtedly exploit. And they were coming. The faint blips on the long-range scanners were growing stronger, closer, like shadows creeping toward an inevitable reckoning. Kara sat in the dim light of the engineering bay, her hands smeared with grease as she worked to patch a failing power conduit. The hum of machinery filled the silence, a reminder of the ship's fragility. The crew had been avoiding her, not out of distrust. She had earned their respect, but because of the weight of Thren's words. They knew what the enemy thought of humans, and now that knowledge hung over her like a storm cloud. The captain's voice broke through the ship's intercom, sharp and commanding. All hands to the bridge. Enemy ships closing in. Kara dropped her tools, her heart pounding. This was it, the moment they had all been dreading. She wiped her hands on her jumpsuit and made her way to the bridge, the corridors eerily quiet as the crew gathered. When she arrived, the atmosphere was electric, the tension palpable. The tactical display flickered to life, revealing a formation of enemy ships closing in fast. There were too many, their firepower overwhelming. The crew's expressions ranged from grim determination to quiet resignation. They had survived the nebula. But this felt different. This felt final. The captain stood at the center of the bridge, his fur bristling as he studied the display. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of desperation. Suggestions. The room was silent. The crew exchanged uncertain glances, their usual confidence eroded by exhaustion and doubt. Kara stepped forward, her voice cutting through the stillness. We can't outrun them, and we can't outgun them, she said, but we can outthink them. All eyes turned to her. The captain raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. Explain. Kara gestured to the tactical display, her mind racing. The enemy's formation was tight, their ships moving with mechanical precision. They were predictable, efficient, but efficiency could be a weakness. She thought back to the nebula, to how they had turned chaos into an advantage. They're expecting us to fight defensively, to try and hold out, she said. But what if we don't? What if we take the fight to them? The crew murmured in confusion, but Kara pressed on. We still have the modified drones from the nebula. If we load them with the remaining explosives and send them in waves, We can force the enemy to break formation. Once they're scattered, we use the ship's cargo to create decoys, fake targets that draw their fire. It won't destroy them, but it'll buy us time to strike where it hurts. The plan was audacious, reckless even, but it was the only chance they had. The captain studied her for a long moment, his sharp eyes narrowing as he weighed the risks. Finally, he nodded. Do it. The crew sprang into action, the bridge coming alive with activity. Drones were prepped, explosives carefully loaded. The ship's cargo was repurposed once again, each crate and container transformed into a weapon or decoy. Kara worked alongside the engineers, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. Every second counted, and she refused to let fear slow her down. When the first wave of drones launched, the tension on the bridge was suffocating. The crew watched the tactical display as the drones raced toward the enemy formation, their signals blinking out one by one. Then the first explosion lit up the screen, followed by another and another. The enemy ships faltered, their tight formation unraveling as they scrambled to evade the blasts. The second wave of drones followed, this time carrying decoys that emitted false energy signatures. The enemy ships fired wildly, their precision turning to chaos. Kara's plan was working. The crew cheered, a brief moment of triumph cutting through the fear. But the enemy wasn't done. Their ships regrouped, adapting to the new strategy with alarming speed. The largest of them, a massive dreadnought bristling with weapons, pushed forward, its sights locked on the Ecliptica. The captain's voice cut through the cheers, sharp and urgent. They're targeting the bridge. Brace for impact. The ship shuddered violently as the dreadnought's weapons fired, the shields barely holding. Kara grabbed onto a console, her mind racing. They needed to disable that ship, and fast. She turned to the captain, her voice steady despite the chaos. We need to hit their power core. One strike, right at the center. It's the only way to stop them. The captain hesitated, his sharp eyes searching hers for any sign of doubt. Finding none, he nodded. Do it. Kara bolted from the bridge, her heart pounding as she made her way to the weapons bay. The final drone sat waiting, its sleek frame gleaming in the dim light. She worked quickly, programming it for a direct strike on the dreadnought's power core. When it was ready, she activated the launch sequence and stepped back. The drone shot out into the void, its signal blinking steadily on the tactical display. The crew watched in silence as it weaved through the chaos, evading enemy fire with precision. When it reached the dreadnought, the signal disappeared. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen lit up with a blinding explosion, the dreadnought's massive frame disintegrating in a burst of light and debris. The crew erupted into cheers, their voices a mix of relief and exhilaration. Kara slumped against the wall, her body trembling with exhaustion. They had done it. Against all odds, they had survived. But as the crew celebrated, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The enemy knew what humans were capable of now, and they wouldn't stop until they had eliminated that threat. As the Ecliptica limped away from the battlefield, Kara looked out at the endless expanse of stars. The galaxy was vast and unforgiving, but she knew one thing for certain. Humans weren't just survivors. They were fighters, thinkers, and dreamers. And no matter what came next, they wouldn't go down without a fight. A new dawn. The silence aboard the Ecliptica felt heavier than the battle had been. The aftermath of their desperate stand left the ship drifting through the star-speckled void, its systems strained, its crew battered, and its unity fragile but unbroken. The bridge lights flickered as Kara leaned against the console, staring at the swirling debris field where the enemy dreadnought had once loomed. The victory was undeniable, but the cost lingered in the air like the faint scent of scorched metal. The captain stood at the viewport, his tall, furred frame outlined by the dim glow of a distant star. He didn't speak, not yet. The crew was silent as well, each member processing the events in their own way. Some sat slumped at their stations, exhaustion written across their faces. Others tended to wounds, their movements careful and deliberate. Kara felt the weight of their gazes, their unspoken gratitude mingling with a lingering fear. She exhaled slowly, her hands trembling as the adrenaline faded. They had survived, but survival didn't mean safety. The enemy had retreated, but it wasn't a retreat born of defeat. It was strategy, a regrouping for an attack that would come later, stronger and more calculated. The galaxy wasn't safe for them now. It might never be. The captain finally broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "We've bought ourselves time. Time to repair, time to plan. But we're marked now, every one of us." The crew nodded in solemn agreement. The reality was unavoidable. The Ecliptica had become something more than a cargo ship. Its survival was a message, a defiance that the galaxy's power players wouldn't ignore. Kara stepped forward, her boots echoing softly on the metal floor. "Then we use that time wisely," she said. Her voice carried an edge of resolve, a tone that had grown stronger with every trial they had faced. "We've proven we can survive, even against impossible odds. But survival isn't enough. We need to prepare for what's coming." The captain turned to her, his sharp eyes narrowing as he studied her. There was no longer any doubt in his gaze, only a quiet respect. "What are you suggesting?" Kara's mind raced, piecing together fragments of ideas that had taken root during the battle. The crew wasn't just a collection of individuals anymore. They were a team, a family forged in fire. They had strengths, resources, and a shared determination to fight for their survival. But they needed more than that. They needed a plan. "We don't just fix the ship," she said. "We make it better, stronger. We turn every weakness into a strength, and we don't wait for them to find us. We go on the offensive, not with weapons, but with ideas, information, alliances." The room fell quiet again, but this time it wasn't the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of consideration, of a crew seeing the glimmer of a future where they weren't just running. They were fighting back on their own terms. The captain nodded slowly. "If we're going to do this, we need everyone. Every skill, every perspective. No one sits on the sidelines." Kara's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and apprehension. This wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, not when she had signed up to clean vending machines and mop floors. But it was the life she had now, and for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Over the next days, the Ecliptica became a hive of activity. Repairs were made, not just to restore the ship but to transform it. The engineers, inspired by Kara's unconventional ideas, worked tirelessly to redesign systems, repurpose cargo, and integrate the lessons they had learned in battle. The once divided crew came together in a way that felt natural now, their differences becoming assets rather than obstacles. Kara found herself at the center of it all, her presence a source of stability and inspiration. She didn't have all the answers, but she had learned to ask the right questions, to push others to see possibilities where none seemed to exist. The crew rallied around her not because she was exceptional, but because she made them feel exceptional. They were stronger together, and they all knew it. As the ship began to take shape, so did their plan. The enemy's obsession with humanity was both a curse and an opportunity. If the Ecliptica could uncover why humanity was considered such a threat, they could use that knowledge to their advantage. Kara's instincts told her it wasn't just about their adaptability or ingenuity. There was something deeper, something the enemy feared. The moment came sooner than expected. The ship's newly enhanced sensors detected a faint signal, a distress beacon emanating from deep within uncharted space. The crew debated whether to respond, wary of a trap, but Kara's gut told her this was important. The beacon was human, and if there were others out there, they couldn't ignore the chance to find them. The Ecliptica altered its course, its patched hull gleaming under the light of distant stars. As they approached the source of the signal, the tension aboard the ship grew. The unknown was a double-edged sword, but it was also where humanity thrived. When they arrived, The sight that greeted them was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. A massive structure drifted in the void, its design unmistakably human but ancient, its surface scarred by time and conflict. The beacon pulsed steadily, a heartbeat in the darkness. The captain turned to Kara, his voice calm but expectant. "What now?" Kara stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the structure. She didn't have all the answers, but she had something better, the resolve to find them. She looked back at the crew, her voice steady and clear. "We go forward." The ship moved closer, its lights cutting through the shadows. The crew braced themselves for whatever awaited them, their unity now their greatest strength. As the Ecliptica docked with the ancient structure, Kara felt a strange sense of calm. They had faced the worst the galaxy could throw at them, and they had survived. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Because that was what humans did. They adapted. They endured. And most of all, they kept moving forward.